Representatives from over 190 nations met recently in Lima, Peru, for talks that lasted 2 weeks as they tried to hammer out a deal on how to fight climate change. The talks, organised by the United Nations, have resulted in an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The deal provides a framework for a major climate change accord to be signed by world leaders at a Paris summit in 2015. We begin with CCTV's Dan Collins, who's been covering the summit in Lima. Dan, thanks for joining us. As is usual with these negotiations, 2 weeks of talks followed by down-to-the-wire agreement. What can you tell us about it?
Absolutely right, Nathan. Running into extra time. And finally, in the 11th hour, actually after the talks had officially ended in the early hours of Sunday morning, approval was reached for the fourth draft of this agreement. It was finally signed off on by all the nations present. This agreement is important because it puts the world on the road to a much bigger agreement, which will be negotiated in Paris next year. And that deal the UN hopes will put the world and the international community on course to combat climate change over the next 3 to 4 decades. What was agreed here in Lima was the draft text of that deal, and the real achievement of what the Peruvian presidency of these climate change talks managed to do is really get all those 195 plus nations on the same page.
Well, you say the same page, Dan, but there was a lot of back and forth between developing nations. What are the main stumbling blocks?
Yes, the agreement was delayed by hours and hours because of those stumbling blocks, and it came down to the classic divide between developed and developing nations, as you mentioned. But finally, compromise was reached, which managed to satisfy, for example, on one hand, the United States and the European Union, who were asking that pledges made by countries were put up front, pledges on how they would cut carbon emissions. It also managed to satisfy the needs of the small island states and the countries most affected by climate change, those specific islands which are threatened by rising sea levels, by acknowledging that they could get compensation for loss and damages caused by climate change. And it also managed to level out this kind of binary distinction which has existed since these talks began in the early 90s between the developed and the developing world, putting much more responsibility on the richer nations. The US in particular were asking that be balanced out so that emerging economies such as India and China also play their part in a unified response to cutting their carbon emissions and helping to combat global warming. Because, of course, John Kerry was here just a few days ago. He laid that out very clearly. Dan, 196 nations nearly happy with the deal, but environmentalists not. They're basically saying that this agreement, if implemented, won't stop global warming and could lead to even more climate change. Why are they so angry? Well, that's right. They say that, well, some are saying that no deal would have been better than this deal, which is a weak deal, which doesn't really lock the countries into legally binding efforts to cut their carbon emissions, legally binding efforts to combat global warming, and it's very open-ended. I think that's really the nature of a compromise. They say that in some ways it would have been better to have no deal than a weak deal. Others, of course, say that the fact a no deal would have been a disaster, and disaster's been averted. The real achievement after 2 weeks of talking, trying to find some kind of consensus between more than 190 nations with so many different economic and national interests, oil-producing nations, developing nations, wealthy nations. The real achievement has been the fact that all signed on to this deal. None of them are perfectly happy with it. None of them really like it. But it shows that there's political will to combat climate change. And what can be done between now and the end of 2015, that important Paris deal, is the details can be ironed out. The countries' pledges can be finally verified, and some of the financial aid details, which the developing world is very much asking for, can also be clarified. So, yes, it's the first step, really, on a long road, but it is an achievement nonetheless. Dan Collins in Lima, Peru, thank you very much.